Good evening, members, and welcome. For those of you I've never met before, my name is Anna Spooner, and I'm part of the tastings and events team at the Wine Society. And I'm joined behind the scenes this evening by the ever faithful Mahesh, who will be on hand to answer any problems you have, if you pop those in the chat for us, and then also to look through the Q&As. So please do feel free to add any questions that you do have into that Q&A section. I'm hoping that we're going to have time, but to be honest, as Tim Sykes, our buyer for Bordeaux, said when I told him I was doing 45 minutes to whistle my way through Bordeaux, he said, fat chance and good luck. So I'm going to try my best to leave a few minutes at the end for questions, but Mahesh is really great as well at feeding them through to me. I've got two screens so I can see if you do have anything to ask, then I might be able to answer it as we go. And who knows, I might be about to answer it as well. So welcome to any newbies. If you haven't joined a sip size before, then I'm really glad this is your first one, but it will be a whistle stop. It might not be what you're used to, should we say, in an online tasting. What we try and do in sip size is condense a lot of information into a small period of time, and we're going to taste 3 wines that tell the story that I'm trying to get across. Obviously, in 45 minutes, there's going to be huge gaps, particularly in Bordeaux. So naturally, there's certain things that I'm going to focus on. I'm not going to focus on grape varieties this evening. I'm going to talk a little bit about them, but really I've done a sip size on Cabernet, on Merlot. Matthew Horsley's done an incredible one in Sauvignon. And then hopefully in the future, I might do Cab Franc. If you saw Loire last week, I mentioned quite a bit about Franc anyway, but we'll talk about it as we go. But if you really want to learn about those grape varieties in particular, and you haven't seen those recordings, I do encourage you to go back onto our YouTube channel and have a look at those. So, I will say just one more thing. Sorry, Mahesh asked me to remind everyone this week. When you're using the chat, if you want to speak to Mahesh or I, you can select our names. So Mahesh's Tastings team and I'm Anna Spooner. If you want to speak to everyone, so if you've got an opinion about the wine or you want to ask a more general question, please do click on everyone in the chat. Because that will mean that every member that's joined this evening can see you. And we had 400 registrations, so don't say anything rude because 400 fellow members may see it. Anywho, let's crack on because I really am conscious of time. So what are we going to do today? I'm going to talk to you a teeny tiny bit about climate, very little. We're going to whip through some history of Bordeaux because I actually think that is really important. We are going to talk a bit of white grapes and white wine regions, a bit of red grapes and red regions, and we'll enjoy the relevant wines as we go. And then I will very quickly, I hope, explain the classification system because it's quite an important part of Bordeaux. And I know it can be really daunting and it doesn't have to be. So it definitely doesn't have to be if you're like me and you can't afford any of the top ranking ones anyway, but it's definitely when people start to talk about the top wines of Bordeaux, it's really good if you can have a bit of base knowledge about where certain things are. What is a Premier Cru? So we'll talk about that as well. So let's kick off. I'm just going to share my screen, I hope. Bear with me a moment. But basically, top line stats of Bordeaux. Well, there are 57 full appellations across Bordeaux. And actually the bigger picture, so the whole of Bordeaux itself, is the largest appellation producer of wine in France. Ooh, apologies, I'll just get my map up there for you. And this is what it looks like here. So as I said, biggest producer of appellation wine in France. They call it kind of the Vineyard of France. And it's obviously the most famous as well. It produces a range of styles. So Cremant, which is basically a traditional method sparkling wine made outside Champagne. It does produce Cremant. If I'm honest, of all the sparkling Cremants in France, it's not up there with what I would call the top quality. We actually don't really sell it either. The grape varieties that go into it, as we'll go on to the whites, don't lend themselves to sparkling, but it does exist. And when you're in Bordeaux, it's lovely and refreshing and gorgeous. So Cremant, it does do. White, we'll talk about in detail. Rosé, we won't, but it's worth mentioning there are two styles. One is a sort of normal paler, still not pale, but a pressed rosé. The other is a rosé made in a slightly different way. I will do a whole session on rosé production later next year. But it's made in a slightly different way, and it's called claret. And they believe that's where claret comes from, because it's actually effectively a pale red wine. It does produce red wine, arguably its most famous export, but its second most famous export, nipping at the heels, is the sweet wine. And sadly, we won't be able to cover those this evening, but Sauternes, Barsac, I will mention them and where they're produced, but we won't be able to taste them or cover them in detail. But it's a very special place to produce sweet wine. And I'll just show you, I'm just going to laser, sorry, because it does help. I like my laser. Oh no, I've snuck ahead. My laser's not working. Never mind. You can see my arrow pointer. So the sweet wines are in this little yellow region here. And one of the reasons that this particular part of the world produces such amazing sweet wines is they have this beautiful rot called Botrytis cinerea, and it grows because of the proximity, and it produces such wines because of the proximity to the rivers. The two rivers that you can see joining up are the Dordogne and the Garonne, and they join up to make the Gironde. And these rivers and this confluence of rivers are what make Bordeaux so special. So I'll quickly name the regions, but we're going to come back to it in a minute. This area is largely called the left bank. In the top here, this purple bit, we have the Médoc. Down here, we have what's largely called Grave. That's sort of the generic name for this area down here. Then when we skip over the river, we have what's the most poetically named area called Entre deux Mers, between the two seas, because it's between the two rivers. And then moving over to what we call the right bank, we have Saint-Emilion and its satellites, so all of the area around. And then up here, the Côte Amblay, the Bourgogne area. And this is probably you're less likely to hear about these wines up here, but there are some amazing value wines. We're not going to have too much time to talk about them today, but there's some quite fun stuff going on up there. So if you are interested in wines of Bordeaux, then do look out for the Bourgogne wines, because I personally really like them. You get all sorts of quirky things going on up there, which is great fun. So really quickly, I said I was going to talk climate, and I'm going to be very fast, because basically you're talking about a region that gets a decent amount of rainfall, but it tends to fall in quite stormy conditions. The reason is we're right next to the Atlantic Ocean, and there's very little protection. Whilst there is a little forest here, the Lalande forest, there isn't actually a huge amount of protection. And so what tends to happen is there will be sort of big rainstorms that come in, which is great for getting enough. It's not a region that needs to irrigate, but it's still warm. We're still at a reasonably low latitude, so the grapes can ripen beautifully, but you do get that water. Interestingly, the other thing is that it's quite flat, and it's so flat that if you are stupid enough like me, you can run a marathon around the Médoc on the left bank of of Bordeaux. And this is me outside Chateau L'Orange, which is a third growth. You'll learn what that means later, in Saint-Julien in the Médoc. So if you are silly enough, it's flat enough to run a marathon. Unlike any other, it involves a lot of drinking wine. Safe to say I didn't make the full 26 miles. I made it around about 20, but I consumed an awful lot of fantastic left bank Bordeaux wine and ate like a queen, because they have food and drink stations all the way around. So yeah, it's not the sort of marathon where you go to try and get your best time. You do have the best time. That was no pun intended there. But quickly, let's do a little bit of history, and I'm going to make this briefer than I planned to, because I'm conscious of time and I want to get on to tasting. If you do want to start, please do, because nothing goes better with a little history lesson than a glass of Bordeaux. So crack open any glass that you'd like to so far. But a tiny bit of history, because it does explain a couple of things. One, it explains why Brits love Bordeaux so much. And two, it explains why the most famous bit of Bordeaux, arguably, that left bit, is so flat. So, whistle-stop tour. In 1152, I mentioned this last week, Eleanor, the Duchess of Aquitaine, this region, the water region of France by the Atlantic, and Henry, who then became the King of England, were married. And I believe Aquitaine technically became some sort of subzone of England. But what it meant is that there was a monopoly of wines coming to Great Britain from this area. So the English courts were full of Bordeaux and some Loire wines. Please keep in mind, though, at that point, the left bank, that purple bit I ran the marathon round, did not exist. I'll mention it in a second, but it was the right bank. So where our Saint-Emilion's from. And that's the oldest part of Bordeaux. Then there was the 100 Years' War, pretty bad for business. People tend not to buy wine off their enemies. So not much Bordeaux drunk. We actually moved down to port at that point, the Brits. And then in the 1400s, the Battle of Castillon saw us give the Aquitaine region, the Aquitaine region went back to the French. That's the first chapter. Second chapter is the Dutch arriving. The Dutch came in the 17th century and they were big wine traders, big buyers. They liked the wines of Bordeaux. So what they did, and I'll just whack the map up again really quick, is they actually, see this bit here is all very green. This was actually, I don't know whether you want to call it marshland here, but the Dutch, knowing a thing or two about drainage, they actually drained the Medoc. So they drained this purple part and found these gravelly soils underneath. And whilst they were draining it and deciding to plant vines here, they also brought new winemaking techniques. So as much as we have the Brits to thank for the consumption of the red wines, and particularly red wines of Bordeaux, we have the Dutch to thank for really modernizing it and actually giving us some of the most famous appellations in the world. So that's chapter 2 over. We then see the Brits loving Bordeaux again. The thing was claret, so this sort of reddish wine from France, or claret, but now claret in the English lexicon. And then in 1855, we get a classification system begins. And I'm going to go on to that when we get to it, but we've kind of already seen sort of 500 years of Bordeaux now. 1800s were bad. There were diseases, pests, phylloxera, but the love for Bordeaux was back. And that continued right into the 1900s. So we get appellation systems created, we get some more classification systems. And then in 1956, the last major thing to happen to the region was that there was a very, very severe frost in 1956. And one of the grape varieties that was very common in Bordeaux, Malbec, just really died during that frost and hasn't really been replanted. So I'd say that was the last sort of major turning point in the history of Bordeaux. I know you're all thirsty. I'm thirsty too. So let's talk grape varieties whilst we sip or drink. I'll be sipping and spitting, otherwise I won't get through. But whilst we drink some hopefully Bordeaux white wine, doesn't matter if you haven't got exactly the wine I'm tasting tonight. I'll talk about it in a moment. But if you're just tasting a white wine from Bordeaux, then the chances are you are going to have a wine that is probably 2 grapes, possibly 3. And those grapes are Semillon, Sauvignon Blanc, and Muscadel. There are others. And actually, for those who've got our wine, the Chateau Tully 2020, I'll tell you what our third wine is in a minute. That's in the other variety. But you can see here it is dominated by 2 particular grape varieties. So let's talk briefly about them. Semillon, you might find in Australia now, but its heartland is here, its homeland is here. And really, this is the only place in France that it's grown of good quality. Good ones, young ones, I should say, can smell very similar to Sauvignon Blanc. They can be grassy, they can be a bit herbaceous. I'd say for me, Semillon is a little bit less kind of green, a little bit more fruit forward, although that's a bit of a strange thing to say. But it ages really well. And that is the key to why Semillon is so important. I'll pop that down. You get the gist. The key to why Semillon is so important in the white wines of Bordeaux, but also the sweet wines of Bordeaux, is first of all, it gets the rot in the sweet wines. But one thing about Semillon is that it ages beautifully. And Sauvignon can do that, but really Semillon is the age-worthy one. And it also takes oak really nicely. So the things that Sauvignon Blanc structurally can't do, Semillon can. And when it ages, it goes to this gorgeous sort of nutty tones. The other thing, when it's got botrytis, so when it goes into those sweet wines, you get that real honey character. Whereas the Sauvignon tends to bring the more tropical fruits in the sweet wines. The Semillon brings that kind of more classical, more lemon. Some would argue maybe more sort of minerality. You're getting a lovely, if you are tasting along with me, then you're getting a lovely mixture of Semillon and Sauvignon here. So it's quite hard to make with a blend like this. Sauvignon Blanc, so probably people are a little more familiar with that. You will have probably tried wines from New Zealand, no doubt, but the ones from Bordeaux are really quite different. So Sauvignon Blanc grown here is very green, very grassy. Quite mineral, maybe not as mineral as the Loire, but certainly very green. And it's perfect for the dry whites. It has a kind of freshness that Semillon can add, but maybe not to the same extent. And then the other wine is, the other grape that's very common is Muscadel. And Muscadel is a little more aromatic, more floral, more perfumed. And that's particularly to go into the sweet wines and not the dry white wines. It tends to have quite low acid. But there are other varieties, that 7% I mentioned. We've got Colombard, Ugni Blanc, Merlot Blanc, so white Merlot, and then the third grape in this particular blend, which is Sauvignon Gris. I've just seen a note from Mahesh to say a few people were getting echoes. Is that still the case? I'm hoping not. Do let me know if you've got an echo and I can try and fiddle around with my microphone again, but I'm hoping that that's worked. I'm not getting anyone saying otherwise, so I'll crack on. Good stuff. So this particular wine, if you are tasting along with me, Chateau Tully, I'm going to pop the... John said we have an echo. I'll just swap microphones. Is that better or worse, members? If you can pop it in the chat. I should probably carry on talking. Worse, okay. Let me pop it back again and then we should be all right. Sometimes flicking between the two. Oh, I'm getting worse and better. Right, I'll go with the consensus which was worse. So I've gone back to the original microphone. Right. So this is the wine that I'm tasting this evening, and I hope some of you are also tasting along as well. This is Chateau Tully, Bordeaux 2020. As I mentioned, it is a blend of Sauvignon, Semillon. Well, I should be specific, pardon me. Sauvignon Blanc, Semillon, and Sauvignon Gris. So instead of white Sauvignon, it's grey Sauvignon. Now, arguably, there's quite a bit of colour. I don't think that's come from grey Sauvignon. I think that's come from a few other winemaking techniques that I'll mention in a sec. But effectively, it's like a grey coloured version of Sauvignon Blanc. In terms of quantities, it's about 45 Semillon, 40 Sauvignon, and 15 Gris. So Gris is the sort of top-up little spritz on the end. And it's produced by two gorgeous ladies, Marie and Sylvie Courcelle, whose father was a very astute and esteemed winemaker. And they are both incredibly educated in enology and agricultural engineering, and they've taken on the winery of their father. Majority in stainless steel, but as per quite a few, as is quite common, should I say, in white Bordeaux, some has been vinified in barrel. So 15% has been vinified in barrel. Now, you wouldn't normally do that with a straight Sauvignon Blanc, and it's the Semillon, like I mentioned, that really makes that possible here. It's also aged on the fine lees for at least 3 months, so you get a bit more texture. But colour-wise, it's probably the oak that's slightly, not oxidising in a bad way, but putting a bit of oxygen in the Semillon to give it that gorgeous colour. So smell and flavour-wise, Don't expect it to smell like I nearly spilled on myself. Don't expect it to smell like a Sauvignon Blanc from the New World. That's not what we're going for. Like I mentioned, it's got that restraint, mineral-esque feeling to it. Mine is quite yellow fruited, so it's sort of lemons, but not sharp and tart lemons. It's almost baked lemon in a way. I'm going to have a taste. It's got such a lovely texture. It's got this sort of luscious mouthfeel, but then this zingy acidity. And that's where Bordeaux white wines, I think, just do the most incredible job, because sometimes people are, I think there's an expectation that white wines are often single varietals. And actually, the marriage of Semillon and Sauvignon is such a good marriage. And it does all the things for me, because you've got the texture of the Semillon, you've got that sort of mineral, almost tongue-tingling mineral sensation, like licking pebbles. But you've also got the sides of my mouth really, really watering from the high acidity in the Sauvignon Blanc. And you've got all those fruits as well. So, yeah, I love the wines from Chateau Tully. I think they're great. Just to give you an idea of where they're based, they're in that Entre deux Mers section between the two seas. And this really is the heartland for dry white wine production in Bordeaux. So they do make other colours, but I personally think their white wine stands head and shoulders above a lot of other white wines, and particularly for the price. Let's just check back again. $9.95. I mean, daylight robbery? The opposite. We're robbing. We're doing the robbing. Members are robbing. But it's a lovely expression and a really, really classic style there. So it's a good example of a white Bordeaux. Right, let's move on. Please feel free to sip and enjoy that. Let me know what you're thinking as well. But I am going to move on to red grapes. What we'll do is I'll talk red grapes and then go on to our first red wine. And then I'm going to brave talking about classification to the second one. Let's try it. So, if you're tasting any or similar wines, we're going to be talking about Merlot first, or particularly on the right bank. Merlot is by far, as you can see, the most grown grape variety in Bordeaux. Now, arguably Cabernet Sauvignon is probably the most famous, and I mentioned this in previous sip size sessions. Merlot is the workhorse. It does a really good job, but actually some of the finest wines in Bordeaux are also produced from Merlot. It just has a little bit of a bad reputation. Various things. The film Sideways didn't help. But also Merlot is the master of medium. It's medium acid, medium body, medium tannins. And in a world of 90s and 2000s where we all wanted big punchy wines, Merlot just didn't pack enough of a punch for the general consumer. I think as we move back and we're saying, whoa, 14.5% alcohol is not acceptable, and we're trying to move back to kind of like a more medium ground, Merlot is going to come into its own again. I really do believe that Merlot is going to have another heyday. So don't diss Merlot. It's a beautiful grape variety, and it keeps the wines of Bordeaux going as well, because it's far more reliable to ripen than Cabernet Sauvignon, which actually ripens nearly 2 weeks later. And when you've got rain coming in from the west, that 2 weeks earlier ripening makes a huge difference. So what does it taste of? It's plummy, it's figgy, it's all those lovely things that you expect of a right bank Bordeaux. And I'll show you in a second. Conversely, the other grape that people always talk about is Cabernet Sauvignon. Now, Cabernet Sauvignon is a bit more structured, so it's sort of higher tannins, high acid. Well, it's high tannins more often than not. And it's more on the black fruit side. So black currants, blackberries, those sorts of things, a touch of licorice as well. And it tends to be a much darker colour. The way the berries are means that it's got a lot more colour. We won't dwell on them too much, but it's worth, I'm just going to pop the map up again. Whoops. Ignore the circle. But people tend to say this left bank, the purple bit, that's where Cabernet is king, so Cabernet Sauvignon. And that's because of the gravelly soils here. You remember the Dutch drained it? They sort of revealed these little mounds of gravel, and Cabernet Sauvignon does not like its feet getting wet. So the gravel drains right through, but keeps the Cabernet warm. So Cabernet does best on this left side, and Merlot does best on the right bank. And that's why the two wines we're going to have today, we're going to have a Merlot dominant wine from the right bank, and then a blend actually from the left bank with a lot of Cabernet in there. So let's quickly nip back to our grape varieties. The final one really worth mentioning is Cabernet Franc. I mentioned it in the Loire last week. If you didn't catch it, it's a beautiful grape variety. It's actually the parent of Cabernet Sauvignon. But the reason I made it green was quite intentional because it has this more herbaceous note to it. So it is still black fruited, sometimes red fruited. So you can get a bit of both depending on the climate. Raspberries tend to be quite common. Violets, it can be quite perfumed, but you really can get this herbal note, and particularly green bell peppers. So if anybody's cooking this evening and cutting up any green bell peppers, have a sniff, Cabernet Franc. But other reds, and you can see it's a much, much smaller percentage. You've got Carmenere, which is very sort of finding its feet in Chile now, but is originally from here, Carmenere. Petit Verdot, which you often find sort of sprinkled like salt and pepper into some of the blends. And then, as I mentioned earlier, you've got Malbec, which has, since 1956 frost, really reduced in size. There's not much Malbec being produced now. Those other varieties bring the personality out of the others during the blend. So they're not key varieties like Merlot, Cabernet Sauvignon and Cabernet Franc, but I love to think of them as the salt and pepper. A little bit of them sometimes brings a wine to life. You don't necessarily taste them, but you know when they're not there. That's the best version of a salt and pepper, isn't it? You shouldn't taste salt, but you're very aware when it's not there. So JeanPierre Mox is our Saint-Emilion wine for this evening. The Mox family are actually négociants, which means that they buy grapes and make wine. So they have hugely well-connected family. Don't be put off by the fact that there's no chateau on the label. So a lot of people sort of buy wines and think chateau means good. Négociants are fantastic because they often have their finger in lots of pies. And yeah, it's a really, really fabulous négociant. And they specialize in Saint-Emilion wines. They work with some of the oldest vines in Bordeaux, as I mentioned. That right bank, Merlot, is basically Merlot land on the right bank, and Saint-Emilion is some of the oldest. Sarah's just said, is it like a cooperative? It's not quite. Cooperatives tend to mean lots of growers. The language is changing in France and people are doing multiple things. Historically, though, a co-op would be lots of growers getting together, buying a piece of equipment, buying a winery together, and then making almost like a communal wine, not communal for religious purposes. No, that's communion, sorry, but like a wine that they all share. And négociant will pick grapes and they'll say, I'm going to make this wine from those grapes and this wine from those grapes, and they'll have a certain winemaker. It's a little bit more precise, but people are, the lines are blurring, but no, they're not quite the same. But this particular wine, it's 85% Merlot and then 15% Cabernet Franc. And then you often find that as the classic blend ratio on the right bank, majority Merlot and then a little bit of Cab Franc. I also, Paul, remember one of the Mox family, Christian Mox, I believe, coming to talk to us at Merchant Taylor's Hall. I think it was my first ever in-person event with the Wine Society, and it was so impressive. So, yeah, they are an impressive family. This particular wine, if you're smelling it, it's been grown on the clay and the limestone, which is suited for Merlot. That's what Saint-Emilion soils are. And they say that the limestone brings out the freshness and the clay brings out the richness. I'm sure that's true. It's not what tasting the soil, it's what the soil does to the vine. As I said, 85% Merlot, 15 Cab Franc, and then it's been aged in French oak for 15 months. So have a smell. It's got these lovely red fruits, all those things I've just popped on the screen as well, where we're talking about here, Saint-Emilion, so that you can see it on the map. Lovely red fruits, slightly herbaceous. It's got kind of like a dried thyme smell to it. It's the sort of wine, and this is going to sound awful, but it's the sort of wine you can envisage going really beautifully in a beef stew. Because it's got kind of herbs, black pepper, red fruits. It's slightly developed, So the fruits aren't as fresh as they once were, but in a good way. So you get this kind of like more mature cooked fruit, which is really delicious. I love it. David says, I suspect it will improve. I suspect the same. Well, I hate to use the word improve because I think it's drinking beautifully now, but I suspect it will develop, David. And yes, if you like your wines a little more aged, then definitely. I mentioned opening the wines a little earlier if you could. And in particular, funnily enough, this wine actually, when I first tasted them, needed a little bit longer to open up. So if you're finding it a bit closed and you've only just opened it, give it half an hour. It really does open up. I'm going to have a taste. Yeah, lovely. All the things that Merlot does. So the tannins are there, but they're not too hard. A lot of people use the word smooth to describe Merlot. And whilst I'm really not a fan of the actual word because it means different things to different people, I totally understand that it's not always easy to find the words, and smooth does a good job to describe the tannins in Merlot. Plushy, soft, velvety. There's some more words. Quick question from Nigel before we move on. How is it that the oak is not very pronounced? It's not new oak. So the oak barrels are older. So what that means is it will soften those tannins. It will sort of bring the structure of the wine into play a bit, but you're not going to get things like smoke, cigar box, cedarwood, flavour of oak. You're getting all of the massage that oak barrels do without the sort of flavour slapped on the front of it. So old oak barrels are a gorgeous thing. Yes, soft, subtle, lovely, great words, Barry Noble. Right, now on to the scary bit, and I promise it's not scary, and it's even less scary if you have a glass of wine in your hand. So feel free to carry on drinking the Centimignon, or if you're still on the white, keep going, or if you'd like to move on to the Homerdoc, you can also try that as well. But I'm going to really quickly, and I mean really quickly, talk through the classifications of Bordeaux, because you don't want to get tricked out by spending too much money on something. You also want, if you decide you like something, you kind of want to know what it is. And I'm doing classifications rather than cru, because I'm going to do a whole other session on the cru of Bordeaux. The cru meaning all of these individual little names. So Pauillac is a cru, it's a little area. Or Centimignon is a cru. So I'm not going to cover what the styles are of each cru. Tim Sykes has actually done a good zoom on that already, albeit quite a sort of serious one, less sip-sizey. So I will cover the crus of Bordeaux at some point, don't worry. But I think here I really wanted to cover the classification. So what is all this Premier Cru, well, Grand Premier Cru, first growth, second growth? What is all this stuff? So the classification system in Bordeaux began in 1855. And I say began, there's a few different types of classification. This is the original classification system. 1855, Napoleon third, don't hold me to that. One of the Napoleons, I think it was third, asked the producers of Bordeaux to rank or particularly the Medoc, this purple left area, to rank themselves for a universal exhibition and to make it easier for consumers to choose what they wanted to buy. And they ranked themselves basically by market value, by the price people were prepared to pay already on an open market. That 1855 classification from that one exhibition has largely remained unchanged, and it is the most famous classification in the world. It's worth noting that the chateau, the producers are the ones that are ranked, unlike Burgundy. Burgundy, they rank the soil, the land. So you can have several producers working off a cru like a Grand Cru or Premier Cru piece of land. Here, the chateau are ranked. And what that means is that you get these incredibly famous names. So one of the most famous names that you may have heard is Chateau Yquem. And Chateau Yquem is one of the sweet wines that was classified. There were 27 in total, but Chateau Yquem got the top tier. There was only one Premier Cru Superior sweet wine, and then the rest were Premier Cru or Deuxième Cru, second cru. That's the sweet wines out the way. But this just gives you an idea of how it might appear on the label. One, Premier Cru Barsac. That means it is a top tier Barsac wine. And there we go. This 2009 bottle is fetching for £89. So what does it mean for the reds? Well, it was only, as I mentioned, this purple region and one of the orange regions snuck in. Obviously, they weren't as well divided in those days. So one snuck in, but it's majority of purple and a little bit of orange. And 61 of those were classified. So 60 from the purple and one from the orange. And they are the really classic labels that you will see. So I've put two comparisons here. The exhibition Pauillac is just from the area of Pauillac. None of this 1855 classification, the producer doesn't have one. So it's just from the Pauillac region. So that fetches around £25 a bottle for a 2015 vintage. Chateau Latour, that you may have heard of, which is a Premier Grand Cru, so a top tier, Premier being number one. That fetches for £450 a bottle. And I've put NFS because that's not currently for sale at the Wine Society. That was an example. You tend to buy those wines en primeur. So we don't have those flip-flopping around the website, just willy-nilly to pick up. They're small production on allocation, and £450 for a Grand Vin Chateau Latour is not bad going, actually. Some of these Premier Cru can be incredibly expensive. Premier Cru and First Growth mean the same thing. And effectively, there are 5 rankings. So there's Premier Cru, Deuxième Cru, you get the idea. First Growth, Second Growth, Third Growth, etc., etc. Mahesh has just told me that Latour is normally on delayed sales as well, if anybody, if it so matters, if you were in the market. There is some Latour flopping around the internet, just not on our website. But effectively, when you hear people talk about these first growths, second growths, they're talking about Premier Cru, what you could call secondary cru. It's not quite true. And you will tend to see those on the label. And of course you would, because once you're in the club, you can charge a lot of money for your wines. So first growth, second growth, third growth, right through to fifth growth, and they are much more expensive. Pardon me. So, surprise, surprise, after 1855, the Cru Bourgeois de Médoc, which was it's basically well, surprise, surprise, there's only 60 people involved in that. So the others aren't thrilled. So welcome Cru Bourgeois, which is about as French a name as it gets. And this was started in the 30s. And it basically grouped a list of the best sites that weren't included in the 1855 classification, but come from similar areas and come from all these cru sites up in the Médoc. Cru Bourgeois makes up around 40% of the production of the purple section. You can actually get some really good value here. So here's a Cru Bourgeois that we've got for sale, £25 a bottle for a 2010 vintage. So that gives you a bit of an idea of price. You can get cheaper wines than that on Cru Bourgeois, but you can, I mean, those wines are good value. There's a lot of them, but they're definitely well regulated amongst each other, by and large. Chateau Homerdoc, here we go. Now, this is from a whole different section. So all we've spoken about so far are 2 different ways to classify the purple section. Lo and behold, the orange section Grave got jealous. So they've introduced their own system a year later in 1953, and it's 16 it's actually 16 little sections. There's no hierarchy. There's just 16 municipalities, and they are white and red wine. So it's all Grave, but they're now in a completely different section. So when you see here, Grand Cru Classé, you can see essentially Grand Cru Classé, you might be persuaded to think, oh, man, that might be Premier Cru, etc. It's a whole big price still. And Homerdoc is a fantastic example. Some really excellent wines. Oh, I've just been told my internet connection is unstable. So shout I've got the chat up if you stop hearing me. Lo and behold, the right bank gets jealous. So Saint-Emilion's done its own thing. 1 year later, in 1954, they ranked their own wines. I've again put 2 examples. The wine that we had is an unranked Saint-Emilion for $13.95. The wine on the right-hand side of that is a 55-pound bottle. And again, here you see on the label, Saint-Emilion Grand Cru Classé. There are 82 crus that are designated Grand Cru Classé in Saint-Emilion, or 82 producers, I should say. And of those, there are 18 absolutely top ones, and they get an A or a B next to them as well. So Premier Grand Cru Classé, A or B. Very few A's. Cheval Blanc, if you've ever heard of it, White Horse Cheval Blanc is a Premier Cru Grand Cru Classé A. Oh, that's a mouthful, isn't it? We'll go on to the last one here. I hope it's the last one. Phew. The Cru Artisan. I've put 1994, sort of, because actually the Cru Artisan group has actually been around for a long time, or longer, I should say, since the 80s. And they recognize really, really small producers. Again, we're going back to the Médoc. All the money's in the Médoc. It's not all, but there's good money to be made in the Médoc and good wines to be produced. But here you can see Médoc Cru Artisan. There's 36 of these. It was legalized in 94, but like I said, been going for a while, and is reviewed every 5 years, which is actually quite common for a Bordeaux for a Bordeaux wine to review. I've got a question on that, but I'm going to come to it at the end if that's all right, because I think it's time for us to have a Homerdoc. So Homerdoc means Upper Médoc. This is not as lovely as it would have been to taste a Premier Grand Cru Classé, or a Premier Grand Cru, I should say, really. Classé is the other side of the bank. As lovely as it would have been, this is a non-cru, horrible language there, but from Homerdoc, which is one of the appellations and one of the good areas. So it's still a fantastic wine. This particular wine is made from the producer is just to the west of Margaux. So it's got a lot of similarities to the wines of Margaux. And rather than putting an expensive Margaux on, I've put a really top quality Homerdoc that tastes and smells like Margaux. Soils are clay, limestone and gravel. Importantly, remember where the Dutch drained. And that means Cabernet Sauvignon can thrive here. This particular vintage actually has a tiny bit less Cabernet Sauvignon than normal. So it's 43 Cabernet Sauvignons, actually majority Merlot, but 49, and 8% Cabernet Franc. That is a reduction in their normal blend. Not hugely, by like 3 or 4%, but it's tilted the majority. Now, for me, it's classic Cabernet. So it's pencil shavings, it's black fruit, but because of that Merlot, it's also got some really nice red fruit as well. I can't get over the pencil shavings, though. It's lovely. This was also some age, barrel age, so 35% in barrel. It's got that sort of slightly toasty, slightly cedarwood thing. Smells lovely. Again, I really do hope that you opened this one if you did have it. So I'm going to have a taste. I opened it in advance, sorry. Now, hopefully, if you've been tasting those side by side, you'll immediately notice that the acidity is still high and the body's not too full because we have got a lot of Merlot, but the tannins are completely different for me. They're really coating the roof of my mouth. They're really fine-grained and chalky. They're less sort of soft and supple than the Merlot ones were. I'm also getting slightly more herbaceous notes, that herbal thing, and definitely black fruit, black pepper, a bit of licorice. In fact, it's making my nose a bit funny with the licorice, almost that menthol I hate using. And I don't mean menthol, but I mean that kind of eucalypty, lemsipy thing, but in a really good way, with lashings and lashings of savoury and sort of almost that pencil shaving granity flavour to it as well, which is lovely. So, gosh, I went up to 7:44. I'm going to stick around to answer some questions, but I really do hope that whistle stop tour wasn't too ridiculous. If you do plan a tour to Bordeaux, I'm just going to do one quick pump before I go into questions. Last time I was there, was it the last time? I visited the wine museum in Bordeaux town itself, or Bordeaux city, I should say. And for any wine geeks out there, wine buffs wanting to learn a bit more about wine, I cannot recommend it more. It's an absolutely fantastic place to visit. You get a free glass of wine at the end, which is lovely, right at the top, overlooking the city. But if you are visiting, don't just visit Chateau. It's a really amazing educational centre. And I think, you do aroma testing and all sorts of stuff. And it would do a far better job of teaching you the history of Bordeaux, etc., than I've done this evening. But for all the geeks out there, well worth a visit. So I'm going to go on to a few questions and I will drop that. Yeah, somebody said, what a building. I couldn't agree more. It's gorgeous. You don't really realise you're in a giant snail when you're inside there. I saw one question pop up earlier that I'm going to just quickly cover first because I think it's the most interesting topic, which is, I can't remember who asked it, but somebody I saw whiz up about the classifications I mentioned, particularly 1855, are they a bit old school and out of date now? I think it's a fascinating subject because it'd be very, very easy to argue and say it's ridiculous. There is only one producer that has ever moved up from second to first. So out of all of the 61 reds that have been classified, only one has ever jumped a rung, and it's jumped second to first, and that was Chateau Mouton Rothschild. A lot of talk about whether some money may have changed hands, but actually it's just that the system is so rigid. Now, they claim that they regularly taste and test. I think, and a few other people generally have said similar, that it becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy in the sense that if you have a Premier Cru or a first growth potato winery, then you're going to attract the top talent and you're going to be able to charge more money, and then you're going to be able to reinvest that money. So in a way, I'm not surprised that the first growths stay first growths. What I would say is that there are brilliant fifth growth wines, for example, that should be, if we re-ranked today, far higher than they are. And so whilst I don't have the money to buy any growths, if I did, I might probably shop around that fifth area, because fifths and fourths are really arguably very, very good value for money compared to some of the top wines, which, well, maybe not even that they're even better value for money, but they're certainly a little bit more interesting, I would say, and there's quite a lot of them. So, you can explore. But yes, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I think the other thing is, I didn't talk about it too much here, but for example, the Saint-Emilion, their classification system is supposed to be reviewed every 10 years. And because it's big business, people's livelihoods are on the line. And if they're dropping down a classification system or out of the Saint-Emilion one altogether, they can lose their livelihoods. So it becomes a huge game of politics. So the other sort of dirty, not very attractive side is that there's a lot of politics goes into these classifications. And like them or lump them, they're here to stay. I think it probably dictates price as much as anything, whereas the actual appellation, so the whether it's a Margaux or whether it's a Saint Julien, that's where you can find digging around, and if you like a style, you can go look at that style. If you find a producer you like making a style you like, then great, but you can't deny that classification systems dictate price. And yes, there's huge arguments to say that they're outdated. Jury is out, I would say, but yeah. Okay, so I'll quickly have a look and see if we've got a couple of other questions. Oh, there we go. The out-of-dateness of pricing. And then hopefully, Robbie, that answered your question. How difficult would it be for a Grand Cru to lose their status? Grand Cru and Saint-Emilion slightly easier, but they tend just to avoid reclassifying them. The 10-year thing never happens. Oh, it gets delayed. But Premier Crus, it's never, ever, ever happened. So the first growths of the 1855 classification have never, not one has ever lost its classification. An interesting question. I'll only answer a couple more, and I hope you don't mind. But if you do have any more, feel free to email them. But I've had a question about, is Carmenere being reintroduced into Bordeaux? It is. I don't know whether anyone spotted in wine news or just general news. There's also other grape varieties being reintroduced to Bordeaux. As global warming does increase the temperatures there is a concern, as with all wine regions, about the viability of the grapes they're currently growing. They've introduced or allowed to be planted a whole host of very strange Portuguese grapes that nobody seems to really be using. And instead, I have heard more people are going back to Carmenere, because Carmenere actually is happier with a bit of sunshine. So Carmenere, I wouldn't say so much reintroduced, because it was there already, just in very, very small numbers. But I think people are definitely considering hedging a bit more with Carmenere, for sure. But we're never going to lose the Cabernet Merlot blend. I mean, it's an institution, so I can't imagine too much change. But certainly you might see Carmenere creeping into the blends in the sort of 4-5% region, perhaps. There's so many. I don't really know where to go. Now, I've had an interesting question that Mahesh probably would be better off to answer. How do you think Bordeaux prices will change post-Brexit? It's a tricky question. I mean, one thing we could say is that Bordeaux prices will already change with our new alcohol duty, for example. A lot of the Bordeaux wines are going to be in the upper limit, because a lot of Bordeaux now is at a higher alcohol than it ever has been, 14% centimillion. So that will make a difference. So that's one rule that's come in. But honestly, it's such a complicated area. I would be scared to answer it too much. Mahesh has said they will be going up. All of our shipping costs are up as well. I think that's a carte blanche generic wine prices will go up answer, because it's true. And I don't see specifically how Bordeaux could be any different. Even if you're buying en primeur, you're still going to be slapped with a tax once you take that wine out. So kind of all the same muchness. And en primeur is a whole other subject. And en primeur, and good point, Paul, it does depend on foreign exchange, depends on value of currency as well. So there we go. I'm going to do a whole section on the future of en primeur at a different time, which I know that we didn't cover at all today, but it really does take a bit of unpicking and working out. But it is something that's quite unique and interesting to Bordeaux. But I'm conscious of time. So thank you everyone for joining. Sorry, I knew, and Tim Sykes was completely right, 45 minutes was never going to happen. But we did cover a decent amount, and we covered some hopefully interesting topics that you might find geeky about Bordeaux. I certainly do. I hope that you've got something delicious opened, whether it's one of the wines tonight or something else, who knows. But I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening, dinner if you're having it. Thank you again to Mahesh for wonderfully guiding us through this evening and adding lots of, I've seen him popping up, helping members the whole way through. So thank you again, Mahesh. I hope you have a lovely evening. Next week, we are going on to sparkling introduction to get us all geared up for the festive season. And again, we'll be whistle stopping around some styles of festive wine. So I do hope that you can join us, slightly different to this week. But yes, have a lovely evening and cheers to everyone. Thank you.